January 17, 1945. Luzon Island, Philippine Archipelago. The rain fell in sheets across the muddy encampment, drumming against canvas tents with a rhythm that had become the heartbeat of the Pacific War. In a clearing carved from dense jungle vegetation, beneath a sky heavy with monsoon clouds, American soldiers erected rows of temporary structures, not fortifications, but holding facilities. The air smelled of wet earth, mildew, and with smoke from field kitchens. Through the gray curtain of rain, a column of Japanese prisoners shuffled forward, their boots caked with the same volcanic soil that had drunk the blood of thousands. Their uniforms hung loose on frames diminished by weeks of desperate fighting, faces hollow with exhaustion and something deeper, the unfathomable reality of surrender, a concept their training had taught them was worse than death itself. Among them walked Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto, 23 years old, son of a Kyoto schoolteacher who had been drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1943. He kept his eyes fixed on the muddy ground, unable to meet the gaze of the American sentries who lined the pathway. In his mind echoed the words of his commanding officer from 2 years earlier, standing before their assembled unit in the training grounds outside Osaka. Death before Dishna. The Emperor's soldiers do not surrender. Better to die with honor than live with shame. Yet here he stood, alive, disarmed, defeated, a living contradiction to everything he had been conditioned to believe about himself, his duty, and his place in the cosmic order that the Japanese military hierarchy had constructed around the divine figure of Emperor Hirohito. What Corporal Yamamoto could not have known, standing in that rain-soaked clearing with his shoulders hunched and his spirit crushed beneath the weight of his perceived failure, was that he was about to experience something that would shake the very foundations of his indoctrination more profoundly than the artillery barrages that had finally broken his unit's defensive position. He was about to encounter an enemy that bore no resemblance to the one described in the pamphlets distributed by the Kempeitai, the military police who had prepared Japanese soldiers for contact with American forces. The prisoner of war camps of the Pacific Theater would become laboratories of cultural collision, where the brutal mythology of the enemy, carefully constructed by both sides, would meet the complicated reality of human beings thrust together by the machinery of industrial warfare. For Japanese soldiers raised in a culture of rigid hierarchy, absolute obedience, and nationalist fervor that bordered on the religious, the experience of American captivity would prove to be not the torture and degradation they had been promised, but something far more destabilizing to their worldview: humane treatment, abundance of resources, and a casual egalitarianism that seemed to mock the very principles upon which their entire military culture had been constructed. The Imperial Japanese Army had spent the 1930s and early 1940s building a military force animated by a unique and deadly fusion of ancient samurai codes, modern nationalism, and emperor worship. The concept of gyokusai, honorable death, literally shattering of the jewel, had been elevated from historical footnote to military doctrine. Soldiers were taught that surrender was not merely defeat but spiritual annihilation, a stain not only on themselves but on their families, their ancestors, and the eternal soul of the nation itself. Training manuals explicitly stated that capture meant eternal shame, that American forces would torture and murder prisoners, and that the only honorable path for a soldier unable to continue fighting was suicide. This was not mere propaganda. It was woven into the fabric of military training through months of brutal conditioning, ritualized humiliation, and constant reinforcement of the divine mission to which every Japanese soldier was supposedly consecrated. During the Bataan Death March of 1942, when American and Filipino prisoners had been forced to walk 65 miles under brutal conditions with minimal food or water, their Japanese captors had operated under this same value system. To the Imperial Japanese Army, these prisoners were beneath contempt. They had surrendered rather than fight to the death, and therefore deserved no consideration as warriors or human beings. Thousands died during that march, beaten, bayoneted, or simply left to collapse from exhaustion and dehydration. Those who survived carried memories of casual cruelty that seemed to serve no strategic purpose, acts of violence that appeared motivated purely by contempt for men who had chosen survival over honorable death. This was the context that shaped Corporal Yamamoto's expectations as he entered the American prisoner of war compound on Luzon. He expected beatings. He expected starvation. He expected to be worked to death or executed at the whim of guards, seeking revenge for comrades lost in battle. Instead, he received a blanket, a mess kit, and directions to a tent assigned by number. The processing took place in a large tent where clerks sat at folding tables with typewriters and carbon paper, recording names, ranks, and units with bureaucratic efficiency. An interpreter, a Nisei soldier whose parents had immigrated from Hiroshima before the war, spoke to each prisoner in Keiful Japanese, explaining the procedures, asking for information. When Yamamoto gave his name and unit designation, he waited for the blow, the insult, some expression of the hatred he knew he deserved as a defeated enemy. Instead, the interpreter simply nodded, typed the information onto a form, and said, "You will receive food and medical attention. Cooperate with camp rules, and you will be treated fairly under the Geneva Convention." The Geneva Convention. Yamamoto had heard these words before, in briefings that had dismissed them as American weakness, a sentimental foolishness that would be their undoing. Nations that coddled their enemies, that placed legal restrictions on the conduct of warfare, that treated captured enemy soldiers as deserving of rights and protections. Such nations, his officers had assured him, lacked the will to prevail in total war. Yamamoto had believed this. He had needed to believe it, because the alternative suggested that his own nation's treatment of prisoners, its casual brutality and systematic cruelty, was not strategic necessity but moral failure. The food arrived in the evening, carried on metal trays by soldiers who distributed them without ceremony or malice. Rice, vegetables, canned meat, more food in a single meal than Yamamoto had seen in weeks. Since the American blockade had tightened and supply lines to Japanese positions had withered to nothing. He ate slowly, mechanically, unable to reconcile the substance before him with his expectations. Around him, other prisoners did the same, their faces registering the same confusion, the same cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught to expect and what they were experiencing. That night, lying on a cot in a tent that kept out the rain, with a full stomach for the first time in recent memory, Corporal Yamamoto wept silently, not from relief, not from gratitude, but from a profound disorientation that bordered on existential terror. If the Americans were not the demons of propaganda, if they possessed abundance enough to feed their enemies, if they operated under rules of war that acknowledged the humanity of defeated foes, then what did that mean about the war itself? What did it mean about the cause for which he had fought? What did it mean about the commanders who had sent him to die rather than surrender, who had assured him that American captivity meant torture and death? In the days that followed, this confusion would deepen and metastasize among the Japanese prisoners as they encountered the full machinery of American military logistics applied to the task of prisoner management. The scale of the operation alone defied comprehension. The United States military had devoted substantial resources to the construction and operation of prisoner of war facilities across the Pacific Theater, creating camps that housed thousands of captured Japanese soldiers under conditions that, while Spartan by American standards, represented luxury compared to what these men had experienced in the final months of fighting on isolated islands and jungle battlegrounds. Medical treatment was provided to all prisoners regardless of the severity of their wounds or their rank. American military doctors, trained in the latest techniques and equipped with antibiotics that had only recently become available, treated infections that would have meant death in Japanese field hospitals. Wounds were cleaned, dressed, monitored for complications. Men who arrived at the camp suffering from malnutrition, dysentery, malaria, and a host of other tropical diseases were given medications, intravenous fluids, dietary supplements. The recovery rate among Japanese prisoners was extraordinarily high, a testament not only to American medical capabilities but to a fundamental policy decision that captured enemy soldiers deserved the same standard of care afforded to American troops. This policy had not emerged from sentimentality but from a complex calculation rooted in American legal traditions, diplomatic considerations, and a pragmatic recognition that humane treatment of prisoners could yield intelligence benefits while also maintaining the moral high ground in a propaganda war that raged alongside the military conflict. The United States had ratified the Geneva Convention of 1929, and while Japan had signed but not ratified the agreement, American military leadership had decided that adherence to international law would serve both strategic and moral purposes. Prisoners who were well treated might provide valuable intelligence. Prisoners who could attest to humane conditions might influence enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. And maintaining the standards of the Geneva Convention would reinforce American claims to be fighting a just war against tyranny and barbarism. But there was something more at work in the American treatment of Japanese prisoners, something that went beyond strategic calculation or legal obligation. It reflected a deeply embedded cultural assumption about the fundamental dignity of human beings, an assumption so ingrained in American civic culture that many of the soldiers administering these camps barely recognized it as distinctive. The casual egalitarianism of American military life, the democratic ethos that soldiers of different backgrounds work together toward common goals, the abundance of resources that allowed for generosity even toward enemies, these elements combined to create an environment that represented not merely different policies but an entirely different civilization. Staff Sergeant Robert Murphy, a dairy farmer from Wisconsin before the war, worked as a supply officer at one of the larger prisoner of war camps on Luzon. His job involved coordinating the distribution of food, clothing, medical supplies, and other necessities to thousands of Japanese prisoners. In letters home to his wife, he struggled to articulate his feelings about the men he guarded. "They fought like devils," he wrote in February 1945. "Cost us a lot of good men. But now they are here. They're just scared kids mostly, beat to hell, confused about everything. We feed them, fix them up, treat them decent. Some of the boys don't like it. They remember Bataan. They remember the kamikaze attacks. But orders are orders. And besides, what's the point of fighting for civilization if we act like savages?" This tension between the desire for revenge and the commitment to civilized norms of warfare ran through the entire American military presence in the Pacific. Atrocities had occurred. Prisoners had been killed in the heat of battle. Wounded Japanese soldiers had been denied quarter. Acts of brutality had been committed by American troops traumatized by the savage nature of island warfare. But these acts remained violations of policy rather than expressions of it, and soldiers who engaged in such behavior faced potential courts-martial. The official stance remained clear. Prisoners would be treated according to international law and American values, regardless of how Japanese forces treated American prisoners. For many Japanese prisoners, the moment of deepest confusion came not during processing or medical treatment, but during more mundane interactions that revealed the gulf between their expectations and reality. In one documented incident from a camp in the Philippines, an American chaplain visited the Japanese prisoners to inquire whether any wished to participate in religious services. The chaplain, a Methodist minister from Georgia, spoke through an interpreter, explaining that prisoners were entitled to practice their faith, that Buddhist and Shinto observances would be accommodated to the extent possible within camp constraints. Several prisoners, including Corporal Yamamoto, had stared at the chaplain in incomprehension. The concept that their captors would facilitate religious practice, that enemy soldiers possessed something called rights that extended even to spiritual matters, contradicted everything they understood about the nature of warfare and defeat. The chaplain, misinterpreting their silence as disinterest, had started to leave when one prisoner found the courage to speak. "Why do you do this?" he asked through the interpreter. "We are your enemies. We killed your countrymen. Why do you treat us as if we matter?" The chaplain had paused, considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, and responded, "Because you're human beings. Because our way of life is based on the idea that every person has dignity. Because if we become the monsters that war makes us want to be, then we've lost even if we win the battles." This answer had been translated, passed among the prisoners, discussed in whispered conversations through the nights that followed. For men raised in a culture where individual identity was subsumed into collective purpose, where the emperor stood at the apex of a hierarchy that descended through layers of authority to the common soldier at the bottom, this notion of inherent human dignity disconnected from rank, achievement, or national loyalty was almost incomprehensible. It suggested a social order organized around entirely different principles, a civilization animated by alien values. The food became the most powerful daily symbol of this alien civilization. American military rations, even the simplified versions provided to prisoners, represented an abundance that shocked Japanese soldiers who had spent the final month of the war subsisting on diminishing supplies. The United States military logistics network moved millions of tons of supplies across thousands of miles of ocean, maintained cold storage for perishable goods, operated field kitchens that could feed thousands of men 3 meals per day with remarkable consistency. The prisoners received bread, canned vegetables, meat, fruit, coffee, sugar, items that had become legendary luxuries for Japanese troops isolated on Pacific islands where supply ships no longer arrived. This abundance was not accidental. It represented the full mobilization of American industrial capacity, the transformation of factories to military production, the agricultural output of a continental nation untouched by bombing or invasion. While Japanese civilians faced increasing privation as the naval blockade tightened, while Japanese soldiers scraped by on rice supplemented with whatever they could forage, American prisoners of war ate meals that exceeded in quantity and quality what many had known in civilian life during the Depression years. The contrast was not lost on the Japanese prisoners, who began to understand that they had been fighting an enemy that could afford to feed its captives better than their own nation fed its soldiers. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, a junior officer captured during the fighting on Luzon, had been educated at Tokyo Imperial University before the war. He possessed a more sophisticated understanding of economics and industrial capacity than the average soldier, and the implications of what he observed in the American camps filled him with a despair that went beyond personal defeat. "We were told we were fighting for Asia's liberation from Western colonialism," he would later recall in interviews conducted by American intelligence officers. "We were told that American wealth was hollow, built on exploitation, that their soldiers were soft and would crumble under pressure. But here in this camp, I see supplies that arrive daily, food that would feed a Japanese village for a month given to prisoners without thought. I understand now that we were fighting an economy we could never match, a system of organization that could outproduce our greatest efforts without strain. The war was lost before it began, but no one dared say it." This recognition, that material abundance reflected not merely luck or exploitation, but systemic organizational and industrial superiority, would haunt many Japanese prisoners as they spent months or years in American captivity. They had been taught that Japanese spiritual strength, the warrior ethos of Bushido modernized for industrial warfare, would overcome American material advantages. They had been assured that one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans in combat, that Japanese willingness to die would defeat American love of life and comfort. But the evidence before them suggested a different calculus, that a nation capable of feeding its enemies, of providing medical care to thousands of prisoners, of operating complex logistics networks across oceanic distances, possessed forms of strength that transcended the spiritual or martial. The confusion deepened when American soldiers began engaging with prisoners beyond the basic requirements of camp administration. Soldiers with Japanese language skills, often the say whose loyalty to America had been questioned due to their ethnicity, served as interpreters and cultural intermediaries. These men occupied a complicated position, ethnically Japanese, raised in American culture, now serving as bridges between the enemy and their captors. Many Japanese prisoners initially refused to believe that ethnic Japanese could willingly serve America, could identify as American rather than Japanese. The propaganda they had absorbed insisted that the United States oppressed racial minorities, that democracy was a sham that covered brutal exploitation, that people of Japanese descent in America lived as second-class citizens awaiting liberation by the Imperial Army. The reality, as always, was more complicated than propaganda allowed. Japanese Americans had indeed faced discrimination, had been forcibly relocated to internment camps in one of the darkest chapters of American wartime policy. Many Nisei soldiers serving in the Pacific and European theaters came from families still held in these camps, a bitter irony that was not lost on them. Yet these soldiers had volunteered to serve, had fought to prove their loyalty to a nation that questioned it, had chosen American identity over ethnic solidarity. Their presence in the camps, speaking Japanese to prisoners while wearing American uniforms, represented a rebuke to the simplified narratives that both nations had constructed about identity, loyalty, and belonging. Private Daniel Inoue, who would later become a distinguished United States Senator, served as a translator during the occupation of Japan. In his memoir, he described conversations with Japanese prisoners that revealed the depth of their confusion about Japanese Americans. "They could not understand how I could be Japanese and American," he wrote. In their worldview, these were mutually exclusive categories. Blood determined loyalty, ethnicity was destiny. When I tried to explain that America was an idea, that you could become American regardless of where your ancestors came from, they looked at me as if I was speaking nonsense. Their entire understanding of national identity was rooted in blood and soil and emperor worship. The concept of civic nationalism, of choosing your identity, was alien to them. This ideological gulf manifested in countless small encounters throughout the camps. American soldiers, operating from egalitarian assumptions that permeated their culture despite its many contradictions and failures, treated prisoners with a casual informality that Japanese military hierarchy had not prepared them for. Guards would share cigarettes with prisoners, would engage in simple conversations through interpreters, would show photographs of families back home. These interactions, unremarkable by American standards, represented violations of hierarchical order to Japanese soldiers accustomed to rigid separation between ranks, to formalize relationships governed by intricate rules of deference and respect. In one documented incident that became legendary among Japanese prisoners, an American sergeant named Thomas O'Brien thanked a group of Japanese prisoners for their service to their nation. The prisoners had been assigned to help with camp maintenance, clearing drainage ditches to prevent flooding during the monsoon season. At the end of the work detail, Sergeant O'Brien, a construction worker from Boston before the war, had said through an interpreter, "Good work today, men. You served your country as soldiers, fought hard for what you believed in. That's something to be proud of, even if it didn't work out. Now you're helping keep this camp running, and that's worth something too. So thank you." The interpreter, a Nisei corporal named George Takahashi, had hesitated before translating these words, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. When he did translate, the response from the Japanese prisoners was stunned silence. Corporal Yamamoto, who was among the work detail, would later describe this moment as more disorienting than the surrender itself. "We expected to be treated as less than human," he recalled. "We had been told that Americans would mock us, would force us to renounce the emperor, would try to break our spirits. Instead, this sergeant thanked us for serving Japan. He acknowledged us as soldiers who had done our duty. I did not know how to process this. It contradicted everything I had been taught about the American enemy." This incident was not unique. American officers and non-commissioned officers, operating from their own cultural assumptions about military service and honor, frequently acknowledged the courage and dedication of their former enemies. This was partly pragmatic. Maintaining order in camps housing thousands of prisoners required establishing working relationships and some measure of mutual respect. But it also reflected a genuine recognition that soldiers on both sides had been thrust into a war not of their individual choosing, had fought for their nations, had demonstrated courage under impossible circumstances. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Pacific, had issued directives emphasizing that Japanese prisoners should be treated with dignity consistent with international law and American values. MacArthur, for all his theatrical personality and complicated legacy, understood that the occupation of Japan would require transformation of Japanese society, that humane treatment of prisoners could serve as evidence that American victory represented not merely military superiority, but a superior system of values. Prisoners who returned to Japan after the war would carry stories of their treatment, would serve as witnesses to American power expressed through restraint and generosity rather than brutality. This was soft power operating at the level of individual human experience. Every meal that exceeded Japanese military rations, every medical treatment that saved a life, every interaction where American soldiers treated Japanese prisoners as fellow human beings rather than subhuman enemies, these accumulated into a narrative that contradicted years of propaganda. Some prisoners, particularly older soldiers and more ideologically committed officers, rejected this narrative, maintained their hatred and their commitment to the cause for which they had fought. But many younger soldiers, especially those who had been conscripted rather than volunteering, found their worldviews slowly eroding under the weight of daily evidence that the enemy was neither the demon of propaganda nor the decadent weakling of military briefings. The transformation was not sudden or universal, but it was real. Japanese prisoners began volunteering for work details beyond what was required, began studying English from books provided by camp libraries, began asking questions about American history and government. Some requested to hear American music, curious about the jazz and popular songs that played on camp radios. Others wanted to learn about American farming methods, industrial techniques, educational systems. The prisoners were encountering American civilization not through the lens of conquest or ideology, but through the mundane details of daily life, and these details accumulated into a picture that challenged their fundamental assumptions. Food remained the most potent symbol. The camp kitchens operated on schedules that seemed almost wasteful to prisoners accustomed to scarcity. Leftovers were not hoarded or recycled but discarded. Fresh supplies arrived on regular schedules, transported by the vast logistics network that kept American forces supplied across the Pacific. Prisoners witnessed American soldiers throwing away food that would have been precious to Japanese troops, so the casual abundance with which Americans approached even basic necessities. This abundance spoke to industrial capacity, to agricultural productivity, to an economy operating at scales that Japanese wartime mobilization had never achieved. Lieutenant Nakamura, the officer educated at Tokyo Imperial University, began writing a journal during his captivity. In entries he kept hidden from camp authorities, he wrestled with the implications of what he was witnessing. "The Americans waste more than we consume," he wrote in March 1945. "Their soldiers eat food we would reserve for officers, and they complain about the quality. They possess so much that they can afford generosity to their enemies. This is not weakness, it is a most profound expression of strength. We fought believing that our willingness to die would overcome their material advantages. But what use is willingness to die against an enemy that can afford to keep you alive, that possesses so much abundance that your survival costs them nothing?" This recognition of the relationship between industrial capacity and military power would become one of the enduring lessons that Japanese prisoners carried from their captivity. The Bushido spirit, the cult of death, the glorification of sacrifice, these had proven insufficient against an enemy that could produce aircraft carriers faster than Japan could sink them, that could replace destroyed aircraft within weeks, that could feed armies across thousands of miles of ocean while simultaneously supporting massive industrial production at home. The war had been, in some fundamental sense, a contest between different models of organizing society, and the outcome had been determined not by courage or spirit, but by productive capacity and organizational efficiency. The contrast became even more stark when prisoners learned about conditions in Japan itself. Letters from home, heavily censored but still revealing, told of cities destroyed by bombing, of civilians starving, of a home front collapsing under the weight of total war. Meanwhile, in the prisoner of war camps, Japanese soldiers received regular meals, medical care, shelter, and relative safety. The irony was bitter and inescapable. They were better off as prisoners of the Americans than they would have been as soldiers in the Imperial Japanese Army or as civilians in Japan's devastated cities. This irony was not lost on American camp administrators, who saw it as vindication of their approach. Reports sent up the chain of command emphasized the intelligence value of well-treated prisoners, the propaganda benefits of demonstrating American adherence to civilized norms of warfare, the practical advantages of maintaining order through positive inducements rather than brutality. But beneath these pragmatic considerations ran a deeper current, a genuine belief, however imperfectly realized in practice, that American values demanded treating even enemies as human beings with basic rights and dignity. Sergeant Murphy, the Wisconsin farmer-turned-supply officer, wrote to his wife in April 1945, "I keep thinking about what we're fighting for. Not just to beat the Japs, though that's important, but to prove that our way of life is worth defending. That means something when you're standing in front of these prisoners and you have to decide how to treat them. You can hate what they did, hate the war they brought us into, and still recognize that they are human beings who got swept up in something bigger than themselves. Maybe that's the difference between us and them. We can hold both those ideas at the same time." This ability to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that Japanese soldiers had committed atrocities, that they were also human beings deserving of basic dignity, that the war was just, but individual enemy soldiers were not personally evil, that American abundance was partly built on exploitation and inequality, but still represented genuine material and organizational superiority. This nuanced thinking represented the democratic temperament at its best. It was not always achieved. Racism infected American treatment of Japanese prisoners and civilians. Revenge-motivated brutal acts. Propaganda dehumanized the enemy. But the official policy, the institutional commitment to Geneva Convention standards, the organizational infrastructure devoted to prisoner welfare, these created a framework within which more humane impulses could prevail over the brutality that war inevitably generates. As the war moved toward a conclusion in the summer of 1945, the prisoner of war camp swelled with captured Japanese soldiers. The fall of Okinawa, the collapse of Japanese defensive positions across the Pacific, the tightening noose of the naval blockade, all contributed to increasing numbers of surrenders despite the cultural prohibition against capture. By August 1945, tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners were housed in camps across the Pacific Theater, Mariana Islands, Philippines, Okinawa, and scattered outposts from which they watched the final act of the war that had consumed their youth and demolished their worldview. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by the Emperor's radio address announcing Japan's surrender, represented a different order of trauma for these prisoners. They had already experienced the defeat of their individual units, had already crossed the threshold into surrender that their training had taught them was impossible. But the Emperor's words, transmitted through crackling radios in camp recreation areas, carried a finality that personal defeat had not possessed. The divine ruler had spoken. The war was over. The cause for which they had fought, the ideology that had demanded their willing deaths, the entire structure of meaning that had organized their lives, all of it was finished. Reactions among the prisoners varied. Some wept openly, mourning not their personal survival but the death of an idea, the collapse of an entire cosmology. Others felt quiet relief that the dying was done, that they might eventually return to homes and families. Still others retreated into sullen silence, unable or unwilling to process the magnitude of what had occurred. But nearly all experienced a profound disorientation, a sense that the ground had shifted beneath their feet in ways that transcended mere military defeat. Corporal Yamamoto heard the Emperor's broadcast in a recreation tent, sitting on a wooden bench next to 30 other prisoners. When the tinny voice stopped speaking, when the formal Japanese phrases had announced surrender without using the word, Yamamoto had felt something break inside him. Not his spirit, which had been broken months ago, but the last vestige of the structure that had held his identity together. He was 23 years old. He had spent 2 years in the army, fighting a war that was now revealed to have been hopeless from the beginning, sacrificing for a cause that had been abandoned by the very authority that had sanctified it. What was he now? Not a soldier, not honorable, not part of the divine mission that had given meaning to sacrifice. Just a young man sitting in an enemy camp, eating enemy food, alive when he had been taught that death was preferable to defeat. In the days following the surrender, American camp administrators worked to manage the psychological crisis that swept through the prisoner population. Religious services were organized, counseling offered, work details increased to provide structure and purpose. Chaplains and medical officers, assisted by interpreters, tried to help prisoners process the trauma of defeat and the disorientation of survival. Some Americans felt compassion for their former enemies, recognizing the human cost of the nationalist ideology that had sent these men to war. Others remained bitter, unable to forget the atrocities committed by Japanese forces, viewing the prisoners' suffering as deserved punishment for a war of aggression and cruelty. But the official policy remained consistent. Prisoners would be treated according to international law and American standards regardless of personal feelings or Japanese conduct toward Allied prisoners. This consistency of policy, maintained through years of brutal warfare across thousands of miles, represented one of the genuine achievements of American military administration in the Pacific. It was not perfect. Individual failures occurred, racism influenced treatment, revenge motivated some actions. But the overall structure held, maintained by officers who understood that American credibility in the post-war world would depend partly on how enemies had been treated during captivity. Lieutenant Nakamura, the educated officer who had been keeping his secret journal, would later reflect on this period in interviews with historians. After the Emperor's surrender announcement, I experienced something like a religious conversion in reverse, he said. The god had fallen. The mission had failed. Everything I had been taught about Japanese superiority, about spiritual strength overcoming material weakness, about the divine destiny of our nation, all revealed as lies or delusions. And there I sat, in an American camp, well-fed, receiving medical care, treated with basic human dignity by the enemy I had been taught to consider barbaric. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. I had to rebuild my entire understanding of the world. This rebuilding occurred for thousands of Japanese prisoners in the months between August 1945 and their eventual repatriation to Japan. The camps became unintended classrooms where Japanese soldiers received an education in American civilization that no propaganda could have provided. They observed American soldiers interacting with casual informality that violated everything they knew about military hierarchy. They saw evidence of abundance that contradicted the narrative of Western decline and decay. They encountered concepts of individual rights, religious pluralism, and civic identity that challenged the blood-and-soil nationalism that had animated Japanese militarism. Some prisoners requested books about American history, democracy, economic systems. Camp libraries provided materials ranging from simplified civics textbooks to translated works of American literature. Prisoners read about the American Revolution, the Constitution, the Civil War, the Progressive Era, the New Deal. They encountered a national narrative built around expansion of rights, inclusion of immigrants, transformation through democratic struggle. This narrative bore little resemblance to the propaganda they had consumed about American decadence and exploitation. The process of repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. Japanese prisoners were transported back to their homeland in American ships, returning to a nation physically devastated and psychologically shattered by total defeat. Many prisoners dreaded this return, feared the reception they would receive as men who had surrendered rather than dying for the emperor. The shame culture that had sent them to war still operated in Japan, even though the war itself was over. But the Japan to which they returned was changing with breathtaking speed. The American occupation under General MacArthur was imposing democratic reforms, dismantling the military establishment, promoting labor unions and women's rights, rewriting the Constitution to renounce war and establish popular sovereignty. The emperor remained but was stripped of divine status, reduced to a constitutional figurehead. Land reform broke up the estates of the old aristocracy. Zaibatsu industrial conglomerates were dissolved. War crimes trials held military leaders accountable for atrocities and aggressive warfare. In this context of radical transformation, the experiences of returning prisoners took on unexpected relevance. These men had witnessed American civilization up close, had seen the abundance and efficiency that had crushed Japan's wartime economy, had experienced the democratic ethos that animated American military culture. Some became advocates for the democratic reforms that occupied authorities were imposing. Others struggled to reconcile their wartime experiences with the new reality of occupied Japan. All carried memories that complicated simplistic narratives about the war and its meaning. Corporal Yamamoto returned to Kyoto in January 1946 to find his family home damaged by bombing, but his parents alive. His father, the school teacher who had once spoken with pride about his son serving the emperor, greeted him with quiet relief rather than shame. The war had exhausted everyone's capacity for judgment. Survival had become its own victory. Yamamoto said little about his time as a prisoner, uncertain how to articulate experiences that had upended his understanding of the world. But he kept a small tin can that had once contained American peaches, a relic of the camp kitchen. For years afterward, he would occasionally take out this can and turn it over in his hands, remembering the abundance it represented, the confusion he had felt receiving it, the slow recognition that he had been fighting for a cause built on lies and fed on sacrifice while his enemy possessed wealth enough to be generous to defeated foes. Lieutenant Nakamura eventually became a professor of economics at a Japanese university, specializing in American industrial development. His secret wartime journal formed the basis of a memoir published in the 1960s, one of the first Japanese accounts to honestly grapple with the experience of captivity and the challenge it posed to wartime propaganda. "We were told we were fighting for Asia's liberation," he wrote in the memoir's introduction. "We were told that Japanese spirit would overcome American materialism. We were told that our enemies were barbarians who would torture and murder prisoners." Every one of these claims was revealed as false by the evidence of our own experience. The Americans were not barbarians. They operated under laws that protected even their enemies. American materialism was not weakness, but the foundation of overwhelming strength. And Japanese spirit, unmoored from reality and facts, had led us into a catastrophe that killed millions and ended in total defeat. The story of Japanese prisoners confronting American abundance and the humane treatment that violated their expectations is ultimately a story about ideology colliding with reality. The Imperial Japanese military had constructed an entire worldview based on spiritual superiority, racial destiny, and emperor worship. This worldview required that enemies be demons, that surrender be worse than death, that Japanese virtue would triumph despite material disadvantages. When reality contradicted these claims, when American enemies proved capable of restraint and generosity, when surrender led not to torture but adequate treatment, when material abundance demonstrated a connection to organizational and industrial superiority, the entire ideological structure began to crumble. The prisoners' confusion when American soldiers thanked them for their service to Japan represented the collision of two incompatible value systems. The Japanese military culture could not conceive of an enemy who would acknowledge the honor of opposing soldiers, who would distinguish between just conduct in war and the justice of the war itself, who would maintain civilized standards even toward defeated foes. This required a flexibility of thought, an ability to hold contradictory truths simultaneously, that rigid hierarchy and absolute ideology had not prepared them for. American abundance manifests in the food that arrived daily, the medical supplies that never ran short, the casual waste of resources that would have been precious to Japanese forces, served as daily evidence of industrial capacity that transcended mere numerical superiority. It spoke to organizational efficiency, to agricultural productivity, to an economic system capable of sustaining massive military operations across oceanic distances while simultaneously maintaining civilian prosperity at home. This abundance was not accidental or temporary, but structural, built into the foundations of American civilization in ways that Japanese wartime mobilization, for all its ferocity and sacrifice, could not match. The symbolic power of food in these camps cannot be overstated. Each meal represented a pedagogical moment, a lesson in the relationship between political economy and military power. Japanese soldiers who had been taught that American wealth was hollow, built on exploitation of colonies and oppression of workers, confronted evidence that this narrative was at best incomplete. The United States had indeed built its economy partly through exploitation and unequal exchange, but it had also developed agricultural and industrial systems of remarkable productivity, had created transportation and logistics networks of unprecedented efficiency, had mobilized scientific and technological resources on scales no other nation could match. This combination of factors generated abundance sufficient to feed not only American forces but also hundreds of thousands of prisoners, enemy civilians in occupied territories, and allies whose own economies had been devastated by war. The prisoners who experienced this abundance, who received medical care that saved their lives, who were treated with basic human dignity despite the atrocities committed by their nation's forces, returned to Japan carrying a complicated legacy. They had lost the war but survived. They had surrendered in disgrace but lived to witness Japan's transformation. They had been taught to hate and fear the American enemy but had encountered human beings operating from different values and assumptions. These contradictions could not be easily resolved. Some former prisoners spent decades processing the psychological trauma of defeat and captivity. Others suppressed their experiences, unwilling or unable to speak about events that did not fit the narratives either of wartime Japan or post-war reconciliation. But collectively, these prisoners and their stories contributed to Japan's post-war reckoning with militarism and nationalism. The gap between propaganda and reality, between the promised glory of death of the emperor and the actual experience of survival in American captivity, helped delegitimize the ideology that had led Japan into catastrophic war. When democratic reformers spoke of individual rights, of constitutions that limited government power, of civilian control over the military, of international laws protecting human dignity, these concepts had resonance partly because tens of thousands of returned prisoners had witnessed them in operation, had been beneficiaries of systems that protected even defeated enemies. The American soldiers who administered these camps, who maintained discipline while respecting human dignity, who shared food with former enemies and acknowledged their service to their nation, these men were not saints or heroes of tolerance. Many harbored racist attitudes toward Japanese prisoners. Many remembered Pearl Harbor, Bataan, the kamikaze attacks, and felt hatred toward the enemy. But they operated within institutional structures and policy frameworks that channeled these feelings into conduct consistent with American values and international law. This represented not a triumph of individual virtue, but the power of institutions to shape behavior, the capacity of democratic norms and legal frameworks to override individual prejudice in service of larger principles. The moment when Sergeant O'Brien thanked Japanese prisoners for their service captured something essential about the conflict between democratic and authoritarian systems. O'Brien spoke from assumptions about military service, honor, and human dignity that his culture had taught him. He could acknowledge that Japanese soldiers had fought bravely for their nation while still believing that American victory was just and necessary. He could hate the war while recognizing the humanity of individual enemy soldiers. This capacity for nuanced judgment, for holding multiple truths simultaneously, represented a democratic temperament that rigid ideology could not comprehend. For Corporal Yamamoto and the other prisoners who heard those words of thanks, the confusion was overwhelming precisely because it violated everything their military training had taught them to expect. They had been prepared for brutality, for contempt, for punishment. Instead, they received acknowledgement, food, care, and eventually passage home. This generosity was not weakness, but the most profound expression of strength, the confidence to treat defeated enemies with dignity because the victor's cause was just and required no vengeance to validate it. In the decades after the war, as Japan transformed into a democratic ally of the United States, as former enemies became partners in building a new Pacific order, the experiences of these prisoners faded into history. But their story remains instructive. It speaks to the power of material abundance as political argument, to the strength of institutions that protect human dignity even in wartime, to the difference between ideologies that deify death and civilizations that affirm life. It reminds us that the gap between propaganda and reality can be measured in meals provided to prisoners, in medical care given to wounded enemies, in simple words of acknowledgement that recognize shared humanity across the trenches of total war. The prisoner of war camps of the Pacific Theater were not perfect expressions of American values. Racism existed. Failures of policy occurred. Individual acts of brutality happened despite official prohibitions. But the overall record, the systematic adherence to Geneva Convention standards, the organizational commitment to prisoner welfare, the daily evidence of abundance and restraint, represented something real and significant. It demonstrated that democracy and industrial capitalism, for all their contradictions and injustices, had generated forms of social organization and material prosperity that authoritarian militarism could not match. And it showed that American civilization, however imperfectly realized, rested on premises about human dignity and individual rights that survived the test of total war. The confusion of Japanese prisoners when their American captors thanked them for their service was not merely personal disorientation. It was the sound of one worldview shattering against the evidence of another, the moment when ideology met reality and could not sustain the contradiction. In that confusion lay the seeds of transformation, personal, political, civilizational. It was a moment when the lies that had sent them to war began to unravel, when the abundance of their captors spoke louder than all the propaganda about decadent democracies, when basic human decency demonstrated its power to destabilize totalitarian certainty. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson, that the strongest argument for democracy is not theoretical but practical, not philosophical but material, not abstract but tangibly experienced in the daily encounters between human beings across political and ideological divides. The Japanese prisoners who returned home carrying memories of American camps, of food that exceeded their rations, of medical care that saved their lives, of casual acknowledgement that they too had served honorably within their own framework. These men carried a truth more powerful than any propaganda. They had witnessed an alternative civilization, had experienced its abundance and its restraint, and could never quite return to the certainties that had sent them to war. In their confusion and transformation lay the seeds of a different future, one built not on myths of racial destiny or spiritual superiority, but on prosaic but revolutionary recognition that abundance, democracy, and human dignity might form a more reliable foundation for civilization than death, hierarchy, and emperor worship ever could.